You said last night, and I read your whole book and I really enjoyed it, that you had to cut about 150 pages.
At least.
What were some of the things that you wished had made the book that didn't, that might?
You know, it's not like, we picked up a big chunk and did it. It was little things had to be eliminated. So there were details about many of the great people who I write about in the book. It was an ongoing, long time process of discernment. What is really important here? What can we do without? And some of it was a question of condensing 2 or 3 sentences into one, so it was that kind of shortening. And some of it was, let's move this fact into the notes section so it doesn't slow the reader down. That kind of thing. But a lot of it was just stuff that was left out. So, for example, I have chapters where I talk about the principal gurus who came here in the 1970s, for example, all of whom had a following. And I give maybe there's 2 or 3 pages on each. Well, some of them, people have written 300-page biographies of them, like Swami Satchidananda or, Muktananda. And, there's so much to be said. I had to cover Vivekananda's basic life story and his time in America in 1 chapter. Well, as you all know, that's worthy of 300 or 400 pages. So it was a question of which details to leave out and what was most important to give to people. And it was just an ongoing, and some of it was painful. It's like, oh, I really love to include this anecdote, or I'd love to include more details about their particular teachings. But, I had to keep the focus, the book moving and the focus on the impact that the teachings had on the culture. So, of course, I've gotten the predictable emails from people saying, why does my guru only have 3 pages? And I had, if you read the introduction, I anticipated that kind of thing. And so I have a kind of disclaimer in there, and I say that the amount of pages, the amount of space given to any teacher or lineage or anything is not a comment on how good they were, or their quality as teachers or their efficacy of their teachings. It had to do with the impact on the culture. So there's a whole chapter on Vivekananda and then another chapter on the people like Huxley and Houston Smith and all those people who came out of this lineage. And there's a chapter on Yogananda. And there's a chapter on Maharishi Mahesh Yogi because of the impact his meditation had. And I had to make it clear to people that it was the impact on the culture that determined how much space I gave. And so it was really just a lot of, shaving and fine-tuning. So Huxley's great anthology about mysticism, the perennial philosophy, was not saying all religions are the same. He was saying the ethical element of those religions bring one to those common experiences, inner experiences. If people themselves don't have that experience, and if their training is to study the sacred texts and look at, analyze them and do the differences, which is most of what religious scholars do, then they can't recognize that. But there are, one of the chapters in my book talks about what I think is a very important phenomenon. Up until like the 1960s or 70s, most scholars of religion were in that camp of studying the differences, the scriptural differences, the differences in dogma and doctrine and history. The exceptions were people like Houston and Frederick Spiegelberg at Stanford, because they were also practitioners and they knew swamis and they knew gurus, and they had spent time in India, and they had had deep experience, and so they understood and grasped the essence of Vedantic wisdom. And then in the 60s, you had a bunch of young people, many of whom were my friends back then. We took up these practices and studied yoga and went to ashrams and everything. And many of them later went back to graduate school and became scholars of religion. Well, they teach very differently, and they write very differently, and they analyze religions very differently because they were practitioners first, and they've had deep experience. So I have one friend, for example, who changed the way mysticism is taught in academia because he argued that the pure consciousness can be directly experienced. It was not just an idea or a philosophy, because he had had that experience meditating, and he's had an impact. So you have scholars who are approaching religion in a very different way, particularly the Eastern religions. They could not get their voices heard as much in the academy, and so about 10 or 12 years ago, some of them started something called the Dharma Academy of North America, and they have their meetings at the same time as the American Academy of Religion, and some go back and forth. And they've started to have an impact. So, this is a long answer, but then there's people like Prothero probably who are in the camp of studying religion in the traditional ways, who may not fully appreciate the esoteric aspect of religion and really grasp the difference between the inner experience of the mystical aspect and the outer, and so they emphasize the latter. That's my guess. They may not even believe the efficacy of mystical experience because they haven't had the experience themselves.